Welcome to the last unit of advanced biology, where we're going to get into really what are parts of chapters 16 and 18, and then sort of a surface level look at several other later chapters that are in your book as well. But our focus for the next couple of weeks here is going to be on evolution, and in particular, Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution and the way that organisms change on our planet. So I've got essential questions here that we're really going to break this up this year. The first couple of weeks here are going to cover this first set of essential questions. What is natural selection? What did Darwin observe? And how did Darwin explain how all this works? And then a couple of weeks from now, we're going to shift gears into the second set of questions, which is how do we classify organisms? So basically, how do we group organisms? And then we're going to step past that and really look at some more details on some of those groups. And then, of course, focus in the end on us as humans as well, and kind of take an offshoot into some anatomy and the way the body works and that sort of thing to wrap everything up. Now, here we are. This is our last characteristic of living things, actually. Living things evolve. And so we touched on this, the first week of school, basically, and saw a slide that looked a lot like this. And at that time, we said that evolution is change over time of a group of organisms. And so, evolution is the process from which we've, come from organisms that were here before us. At least it's what we believe. And so we're going to get a lot more deeply into what is evolution exactly. And although a lot of people just sort of think of Darwin synonymously with evolution, we want to look specifically at how he explains it, because evolution isn't Darwin's idea. Evolution was here before Darwin and will be here forever after Darwin. But he just did the best job of explaining how it might work. And that's what we want to get into. Now, a couple things to keep in mind, kind of set the stage here. This is one of those telling a story kind of sets of notes here. So, if we think about Charles Darwin, Darwin was doing his work in the kind of mid or early to mid 1800s. And so a couple things that I want to point out first. Don't forget what a theory is. That was also chapter 1, right? But remember, a theory is a well-supported and a testable explanation of something we see in the natural world. And it's supported, by just tons of data. This color is hard to see, I know. Just supported by tons of data. And so when we talk about evolution, we say that there is a theory of evolution. So in today's modern scientific world, it is something that scientists don't really question anymore. And yet it's a fairly controversial topic, right? There are plenty of people who don't quite believe in evolution. It's always interesting to me, a small set of our juniors will usually take part in a summer activity called the Governor's Scholars that you guys might have heard of before, where during the summer they do some educational things with students from all over the state. And it never fails that a couple of them come back the next year as seniors and talk to me at the start of the year because they met all these other students from out in other parts of Kentucky who don't believe in evolution, who are not taught evolution at their schools, and they think that seems crazy, but it's not. It's a topic that some have still been resistant of. So my goal here, if you come from a family where you don't necessarily have a strong belief in evolution, you're 100% entitled to that. But my goal is just to explain to you how Darwin explained evolution, and let you make your own decision on that. And I think once we put the evidence in front of you, you'll probably agree with most of what we talk about. Now, again, Darwin came along in the 1800s. If we think back to the time that Darwin was working in, we're talking the 1700s, right, the 18th century. And at that time, your primary belief was based in Christianity, and that was the belief of creationism, right? Most Europeans, including all the scientists, believe that the earth and life on the earth was just a few thousand years old. They believe that there was an original creation event that probably had to do with God, right? And that those things were created and had not really changed since that time. Now, some scientists started to believe in an idea of evolution, which would just be an idea that organisms had changed some over time. But nobody really had a great way to explain that, and so basically the ideas of the church continued to prevail. Now, there were two guys who kind of started to shift the way scientists and biologists in particular looked at life on the planet. But these guys were not controversial at all. These guys were sort of more quiet. They didn't, directly attack the ideas of the church or anything like that. But Hutton and Lyell were both geologists. They were scientists who studied rock formations and studied the earth itself. And what these two men suggested is that the earth must be much older than people were maybe thinking that it is. James Hutton came along first. He looks so serious here. But Hutton was the one who really studied rock formations in terms of layering. Right? And he said that these layers of rock, they could not possibly form in the time frame that most people believe the earth had existed. The resulting land masses that we have, mountains and things like that, are shaped by natural forces, and they require or would require millions of years for that to happen. Now, again, Hutton didn't come out and say, hey, everybody, the church is wrong. He just pointed out that for the earth to look like it does, we would probably need a lot more time than we had. And then Lyell came along after him. He wrote a book called Principles of Geology. And Lyell basically said, we have to assume that things in the past are a lot like things are now. And when we watch natural events now, it takes a long time to change like a rock formation, right? It takes a really long time for rain to wear away and erode some rock. So he also supported this idea that the earth must be much, much, much older than what some people have suggested. And both of these gentlemen, including this Principles of Geology book, were really big things that Darwin studied and believed in as a scientist himself. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of evolution didn't start with Darwin. In fact, there were a number of, I guess we should probably kind of say, hypotheses for evolution that came before him. And one of the best or the best known hypotheses of evolution that came before Darwin was one by a man named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who I probably don't have to tell you is a Frenchman. And Lamarck focused on use or disuse. He suggested that organisms would sort of obtain or get rid of a trait during their lifetime. And then that trait that develops will be passed on to their offspring. What we call this is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So again, his idea being that in my lifetime I can acquire a characteristic and then I can pass that on to my children. And he said that we would tend to change toward a perfection with our environment. Now, the classic Lamarck example was giraffes. Lamarck suggested that giraffes, when they started, were no different than maybe a horse or camel type organism. It did not have such a long neck and such long legs. But what Lamarck suggested is that some of those giraffes started to stretch for their food. And that stretching made them just a little bit taller than the generation before them. And then when their kids were born, they were a little bit taller than the generation before them. And then those kids stretched to get to higher food and got a little bit taller and had kids that were a little bit taller. Now, hopefully, you're picking up on sort of an error in Lamarck's idea because of what we now know today. But at his time, they didn't know those things yet. Now, again, Lamarck suggests that it was all about use and disuse. Right, so like a couple examples here, right? If birds try long enough to fly, their front limbs will become wings, and then those wings can be passed down to their offspring. Or if a bird doesn't use its wings, something like a penguin, right? Then its wings become smaller and smaller and smaller, and maybe even go away if there's no use for them anymore, no need for them. Now, again, it was all about acquiring a characteristic and passing it on. So, for instance, this little picture, I like this picture for whatever reason. I always think of the aliens from Toy Story going, ooh, the claw, right? But basically, what Lamarck would suggest, right, is that if this crab uses his claw a whole bunch, it can get bigger and bigger. It's like humans building up muscles, right? But then he would suggest that that claw that he had grown larger because of use would pass on to all of his offspring, and all of them would get the big giant claw. Now, again, I don't think you guys would believe that if I worked out a lot more and had big muscles, my kids would inherit those big muscles from me. Or let's say that in my lifetime, I've got a good friend who's an orthodontist, and he's actually missing a finger. He blew it off in a fireworks accident. It's a long story. But Lamarck would have suggested that when my friend Seth lost his finger, his kids would be born with only 4 fingers, right, instead of 5 on his hand. Lamarck didn't understand genetics, right? But he came before the time of Mendel. Mendel was the late 1800s. So Lamarck had a good idea here, that some characteristics would make you better at surviving, and that you might pass those on. But he didn't quite understand that something that happens during your life is not genetic. But Darwin, well, he came before Mendel too, but he just kind of got lucky because his ideas did incorporate the idea that you had to have that trait to start with. You couldn't acquire it during your lifetime. Now, also, one last guy to point out is Thomas Malthus. You might remember that name just barely. You mentioned it back in like chapter 4. And he wrote around 1800, he wrote a paper that was really about economics. It was about, monetary systems and things. But what he said in there is that the human population will continue to grow and grow and grow until eventually we will be limited by our resource availability, right? We won't have enough space, we won't have enough food, we might have too much disease, and it will put a limit on our population. Now, when Darwin, which we'll talk about here in just a moment, started to read Malthus, what he basically read is that some organisms must die. Right? It sounds morbid, but it's true. Right? And so Darwin asked, who? Right? Which organisms die and which organisms survive in the face of limited resources? It's a big question. And it is what spurred Darwin to figure out a good way to explain evolution. All right, so finally we get to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, again, was in the kind of early to mid 1800s. Just to give you a little background on him, he came from a very religious family. Basically, everyone in Darwin's family was either a priest or a nun in the Catholic Church, or was a doctor. And so Darwin went to school and studied science. His dad was a doctor and his grandfather was a doctor, and so they kind of expected him to become a physician. But much like Mr. Burton, he kind of got into medical training, decided it wasn't quite for him, and dropped out. His family also then encouraged him to become a priest, which he really didn't want to do. And what Darwin wanted to do was just study biology. He wanted to be a naturalist, is what we would call that, that just studies the plants and animals in the world around us. And so Darwin, some say, sort of kind of ran away from his family, right, who wanted him to be a doctor and wanted him to be a priest. And in 1831, he became the naturalist on board the HMS Beagle. And you've maybe heard this sort of thing before. This stands for Her Majesty's Ship. Right, so this was a ship that was going to go on a voyage, roughly 3 years in length around the world, funded by the Queen of England, right? I misspoke, sorry, 5 years. And Darwin is supposed to be the naturalist. He's supposed to be the expert on biology and geology. And he is well trained from school, but he doesn't really have a lot of experience in doing this. So when he gets out there, he's just kind of doing it his own way. He takes a ridiculous amount of notes because he pretty much just wants to make sure that he's doing the right job. In this time frame, if you really screw up on Her Majesty's ship, there's a chance that Her Majesty wants your head. So he wants to take this seriously, right? And he takes just tons of observations as they embark on this journey that you see here on this map. Now, Darwin knew, a lot about the plants and animals of England where he lived and where he studied, but he'd never been in other places before, right? So he was fascinated. You could tell by the notes he took by all the different life that he saw on other continents, basically. And what Darwin started to write about in his notes is that the plants and animals that he found in various environments were really, really well suited to that environment, right? And so, they might be kind of similar to organisms that he had seen in other places that were similar environments. But then he also observed the opposite, which really, really intrigued him, right? Even if, ecosystems were really similar, like the grasslands, like I say at the bottom here, the grasslands of Australia versus the grasslands of England, he also would find different organisms in those places. And he just sort of started to question, right? If creationism is true, why wouldn't these things all just be similar across the globe? Why do you see such a diversity of species? Now, he also sort of, I think, maybe around the second year of his trip, started to focus a lot more on fossils rather than looking at the living animals and plants. He started to also look into fossil records, right? The preserved remains of ancient specimens, and building a knowledge about fossils that wasn't real commonplace at the time. And that was just an understanding that the deeper you went into the rock, the older you were going, right? And the more ancient you were seeing. And what Darwin saw is that some fossils really closely resembled things that were alive today, and then other fossils looked completely different, right? And he started to ask a lot of questions, right? He started to ask, why did some of these species maybe cease to exist and we never see them anymore? And then those fossils that looked similar to things today, why were they, why are they similar? How are they related, or are they related to the things we see on Earth today? And so I got a picture of one of the most famous fossils you've probably heard of before, called Archaeopteryx, which looks like a dinosaur in the bones, but then if you look at it, it was definitely a winged creature, right? Like a bird. Now, if you've heard of Darwin, you've probably heard of the Galapagos Islands, right? The Galapagos Islands is where Darwin is known for kind of his most famous work. And this is a small group of islands. I've never had the chance to go there myself, but I would love to one day, off the coast of South America. A group of our students at Mercy got the chance to go here last summer on a trip that went to Ecuador and then spent a little bit of time in the Galapagos. But the Galapagos are a unique island chain. They're very close together, and yet they are different climatically, right? So a couple of the islands are really hot, dry, and barren. Others are more like the rainforest, lots of precipitation, a lot of vegetation that grows there. And so Darwin had this little mini ecosystem to look at in the Galapagos, right? Where you have these varying environments that you can see, and you can have all these different species there. And so Darwin is famous for his work with giant tortoises, which you maybe have heard before. Also with marine iguanas, which kind of look like little dinosaurs. A lot of people don't know that Darwin did a lot of work with them. And then also finches, which is a type of bird that he worked with. And so I'd say tortoises are maybe what he's most tied to, because people just like big turtles. But the iguanas and the finches he actually wrote a lot more about than the tortoises. Now, the tortoises, though, do give us a really simple example that we can look at, right? What Darwin noticed, right, during his trip is that the tortoises on the different islands had slightly different shells. So, for instance, he saw this kind of tortoise on what's called Isabella Island. He saw this kind of tortoise on Pinta Island. and then this kind on Hood Island. And if you notice, their shells have a little bit different shape. Their legs are formed a little bit differently. Their neck lengths are different as well. And so Darwin asks the question, right? Are these guys all related? Did these start out as something very similar to each other? And then he also observed the finches, and we'll talk about this more later too. But he looked at the finches and he noticed that even though they seemed like very similar birds, they would all have different shaped beaks, like you can see in this picture. Some of them these really big, kind of strong beaks. Others more, sharp and pointy. Now, what Darwin started to notice while they were kind of camped out there in the Galapagos, is that he could tell his fellow sailors which island a tortoise or a finch came from based on the shape of the shell or the beak. So it was that predictable, right? That this particular island had this kind of tortoise and this particular island had this kind of finch. And then he also noticed, right, that the characteristics of almost all the animals and plants differed just a little bit from island to island in the Galapagos. And this was monumental, but he didn't realize it yet. Right? It wasn't until he had gotten home, kind of put things all together, that things started to form in his mind. Now, the first thing Darwin realized when he got back to England is that he had collected a number of specimens that are found nowhere else in the world. I always forget what the actual statistic is, but Charles Darwin himself is responsible for identifying a ridiculous number of species that we are aware of on our planet. Like it's something literally like 1/10 of all species that have been discovered on the planet were cataloged by Charles Darwin. And if we go back to the 1800s, it was something more like half of all the species we're aware of on the planet were all categorized by Charles Darwin. So he had done some monumental work. And what he also found by writing some letters, talking to people, talking to other scientists, is that the animals he found there in the Galapagos, right? Like this, here's a marine iguana pictured for you. But these islands that he found in the Galapagos, they were definitely different, right? And while they might have been similar to something found on the mainland in South America, they were very different. And so in 1836, Darwin started to write a book outlining his own new hypothesis that would maybe explain where species come from and how species are modified over time. But the thing is, Darwin was a young man. Darwin was not necessarily well known in the scientific community. Darwin was back with his family again, who was very Catholic, and he just really didn't want to rock the boat. Right? It's kind of the way it's said today. He wasn't ready to publish that book because he didn't want to make a big stink. Basically, he got a job at a university, started teaching, doing other research, and just kind of set out to make a name for himself. Now, over 20 years later, in 1858, Darwin is a well-known naturalist. He's working at a university, he's teaching, he's known for tons of stuff, and he gets a letter from a younger scientist named Alfred Wallace. And Alfred Wallace had been a naturalist himself who was on a voyage and went to Malaysia. And Wallace studied organisms there and came up with his own theory that was almost identical to Charles Darwin's. Now, I'm guessing not many of you have heard of Alfred Wallace before. And the interesting thing is that Alfred Wallace, had he just published those ideas, he maybe would have gone down in history as our Charles Darwin. But yet what he did is he sent his idea to one of the best known naturalists of his time to kind of get his ideas on it. And Darwin turned around and published his book. Now, it's not anything nasty. In fact, Alfred Wallace was cited many times talking about how, Darwin was such a great scientist and was helpful to him as well, and whatever else. And Darwin technically had come up with the idea way before him, but it's still a little bit interesting that he was motivated or pushed to actually publish his book because he didn't want some younger guy to beat him to the punch. So in 1859, Darwin publishes his book. We've kind of shortened the title today to On the Origin of Species. It had a longer name than that. It's actually on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And it's a fascinating book. It's a very big book. It's free on the Kindle. So if you're bored, particularly just at home here on our weird virus vacation we're taking, you can check it out. I'd encourage you to actually, if you have the Kindle app or you have a Kindle, just download it, read the first couple pages. It's interesting just to hear it from, quote unquote, the horse's mouth as he wrote it. But in this book, he lays out his explanation for evolution. And his explanation for evolution is the idea of natural selection. Now, Darwin looked at all these scientists that we already mentioned, right? He read things from Hutton and Lyell that led him to believe that there was a lot of time available on the planet, right? And if the planet took so long to evolve, basically, or to develop, then organisms would probably take a long time to change and develop. Darwin looked at the work of Lamarck, almost 50 years earlier, and realized that it does make sense that changes in organisms would be passed down to their offspring. But he didn't agree with Lamarck when Lamarck said that, these organisms probably acquired those traits during their life. Now, Darwin was still ahead of the time of Gregor Mendel. Supposedly the two of them knew each other. But what Darwin looks at instead is, what if it's genetic changes, right? Differences in organisms that they are born with that just make them better survivors. And then he also looked at Malthus. And again, Malthus telling us that particularly in humans, the population will be limited. And so if a population is limited, who determines or what determines which organisms die and which ones survive? Now, Darwin, like I've mentioned a couple times already, he didn't have a firm understanding of heredity like we do today to go on. But what Darwin did realize, right, is that there's a lot of variation in organisms, but that variation will have a tendency to pass down. Right? Humans will look like their parents. And so, I say in here that Darwin was really the first person to recognize that variation mattered. I don't know about that. That's kind of a massive statement. I'm sure other scientists recognize that too. But what Darwin did notice is that scientists had been messing with variation for a long, long time, except we weren't calling them scientists, we were calling them farmers. And we talked about this back in our genetics chapter when we talked about the dogs, right? Selective breeding. Darwin realized that, if you want traits to come out in the offspring, you select parents who have those traits. So the great example around here, right, would be faster horses. I think I brought that up maybe in the genetic unit. The thoroughbred industry, you mate fast horses to make fast horses. But for farmers, things like livestock, right? Cows that produce the most milk, use those to mate. The biggest pigs, the sturdiest crops you have, use those to create your next generation because those traits get passed down. Now, Darwin gave this a name, right? Darwin called this artificial selection, where nature provides variation, and then humans artificially select which variation is most useful. So, for instance, it might not be the best thing for horses to be the fastest in nature. But if we think that's the best thing, then we'll choose to mate the fast ones together. Again, it might not be the best thing to be the biggest, cattle that we use for beef production in nature. But if we think the best thing is to get a lot of beef from it, then we're going to mate those together. Right? And so Darwin looked at the world around him, though. All the unique organisms out there, like this tiger. I think tigers are so beautiful to look at. And now all I can do is tie it to that weird Netflix show that some of you guys might have checked out at this point. But such unique organisms out there, Darwin was convinced there is a natural process that will also identify which organisms should survive and reproduce. Now, again, if Malthus was correct, the size of a population is limited, right? There's not enough resources to go around when there are more and more organisms. And so we're forced into competition, right? Something else we talked about back first semester. We compete for resources, whatever those might be. And so Darwin makes what I think is a pretty obvious observation. Right? Some organisms are going to be better at obtaining resources than others. Right? And that's true of humans as well, right? I mean, some of us are better suited to whatever it might be. I like to make short jokes on some of you guys in class, but realistically, if the competition is who can reach something off of the top shelf, then me and other taller people are better suited to do that, right? We'll be better at reaching things off high shelves. But if the name of the game is fitting into small spaces, then shorter people are going to do a better job at doing that, right? And so in nature, depending on the resource and depending on the environment, maybe faster, stronger organisms, better camouflaged organisms are better at getting resources. Now, I like to bring this up too. I also love lions. I think they're really cool to look at the zoo and things. And you would think lions, the king of Pride Rock here, king of the jungle are the greatest things because they're so big and strong and fierce. But actually, these desert porcupines are just as dominant in Africa as lions, because lions learn not to mess with them, as you can see in this picture. Right? Even though a lion is big and ferocious and could easily eat one of these porcupines, they learn real quick if they get too close, they're going to get stabbed in the face, basically, with the quills, and so they don't come there anymore. So it doesn't also have to be this huge, majestic organism, right? It might be the majestic desert porcupine that has this better trait that keeps it alive and allows it to get resources. Now we got some terms and some big yellow boxes, which are really important statements over the next couple of slides. So the first term is fitness, right? Fitness is the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce in its specific environment. Now, a lot of times we refer to this as relative fitness. In fact, in the AP class, we never just say fitness, we always say relative fitness. And the reason we say relative fitness is because it depends on its environment. So your fitness is completely relative to where you are, right? It's a question of how well suited are you, or how well suited is an organism to that particular environment where we find it. Now, fitness is affected by adaptation. Now, adaptation, Darwin tells us, is an inherited characteristic. And a successful adaptation would be one that increases your chance of survival. We can change, right? We can adapt. But to successfully adapt means that we change in a way that makes us better at surviving. And so, in other words, here again, yellow box is important. Successful adaptations lead to what we would call higher fitness. Now, anybody want to guess where adaptations come from? Starts with an M, ends with a utation. All right, so since we have already covered genetics, we can safely say right now, and we can understand, that adaptations in organisms come from mutations. Just changes that you're born with. But if these changes are successful, they make you better at surviving and reproducing in your particular environment, or they make you more fit. And so an example of a successful adaptation is a porcupine's quills. Right? This mutation that gave them these little sharp things that stick off their back made them better at surviving because lions wouldn't eat them anymore. Now, this concept of fitness was at the core of Darwin's idea. Right? What Darwin says is that generation after generation, the organisms are going to compete with each other to survive and reproduce. And some organisms will be higher fitness. They'll have a unique advantage that makes them better at surviving. All right, so again, if we look in our important yellow box, organisms with characteristics better suited to their environment, aka higher fitness, are more likely to survive and reproduce than those not well suited to their environment, or lower fitness. So if the higher fitness organisms are the ones that survive, they are the ones that will reproduce, and more of that trait will be present in the future generation. So over time, our whole population, our whole group of organisms becomes more like the ones that are surviving successfully. And that's why Darwin calls this survival of the fittest. Right now, here's just a funny picture that's not real, right? But I think I said at the very start of the year that sharks are creepy, right? I like sharks because they terrify me, but I'm fascinated by them. But if you take a shark out of its natural environment, it's not, right? Sharks are really high fitness in the open ocean, but really low fitness in your backyard. So fitness is all relative to your environment, and we're the same way, right? Humans are, well, we're not the fittest organism in the world anywhere, but certainly out in the open ocean, we are not, because we don't swim well. We're not well adapted to that. And so fitness changes depending on the environment. Now, Darwin called this natural selection because it's so much like artificial selection, right? In both scenarios, the individuals with the desired characteristics are the ones who reproduce. In artificial selection, humans are deciding what is favorable or what is desirable. And in natural selection, nature is by way of just survival. Right? And so what you notice here in this yellow box, over time, natural selection results in changes in the inherited characteristics of a population, changing individuals and increasing the species' fitness. So, sort of in other words, right, natural selection occurs at the individual level. Right? An individual is fit or not. An individual survives or doesn't. An individual reproduces or doesn't. But as these individuals do survive and reproduce and make more like them, we can start to see evolution occur, which is at the level of the group. Right? The whole population will start looking more like that higher fitness thing over a period of time. Example here is a peacock, right? You guys maybe heard this before, seen this before. Peacocks have this big plume. This is a male peacock, has this big plume of feathers. Makes them more attractive to their mates. They're brightly colored as well. Also, scientists have hypothesized that these sort of look like eyeballs, peering out of a shrub or something, so it scares off predators as well. And at some point, there had to be a first peacock like this, right? And then more and more of them become like that. And you might know too that female peacocks aren't all crazy flashy like this. They're usually more of like a gray color. They don't have this big plume because they don't really have to attract mates like the males have to. Now, a couple other terms just that came from Darwin, and these are the things that really started to set some people off, right? Are descent with modification and common descent. Darwin suggests that over a long period of time, natural selection will produce different organisms, right? Organisms that are modified from their ancestors. So in other words, descent with modification. This rubs some feathers, right? Because this suggests that we weren't all just created as we are at a certain creation point in history, as the Bible would tell us, right? And so this is where Darwin starts to tick some people off. He also goes one step further and says something even crazier, and that is that he believes all species share common descent or common ancestry. So basically, you started with some sort of ancestral thing, and it branches into all sorts of different things through descent with modification. Now, we'll get into that a little bit more later too, but this is what basically spits in the face of creationism in the scientific world when Darwin brings these ideas out in his book as well. All right, so that finishes off kind of Darwin's story and the background on what natural selection is. Next, we're going to get into some examples of natural selection and some evidence for natural selection. And then we'll put a bow on all this by talking about human evolution for just a moment to wrap things up for this week.